Vast majority of Americans, nearly 95% of individuals, believe that the US is suffering from an affordability crisis. These are the recent numbers that have come out from a Harris poll conducted by The Guardian that is trying to capture American sentiment about how they feel about the economy. Now, according to the survey, more Americans, nearly 57%, believe that the overall economy is getting worse compared to those numbers in February, where about 46% of Americans believe that the economy is getting worse. In juxtaposition, fewer Americans also believe that the economy is getting better. And this is true across political parties, where across all three political parties, there is rising consumer pessimism about the status of the economy, mostly centered around affordability. A lot of the reason for this, which is something we've talked about on this page several times, is that people feel like their purchasing power is decreasing, right? People are expressing frustration that they are not able to afford some of the necessities that they would otherwise, including food and gasoline. A lot of this has to do with some of the policies that have been recently implemented, including the implementation of tariffs, despite the Supreme Court declaring that the IEEPA tariffs were unconstitutional, as well as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz that has persisted since February, which has increased the price of gasoline, as well as some other imports, including things like fertilizer. And we see this in the economics numbers very clearly, right? We can see the purchasing power of Americans declining over the last several months. If we look at things like inflation, right? If we compare the rate of inflation, both the CPI released by the BLS and the PCE, the personal consumption expenditures released by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, we can see those rates of inflation increasing much faster compared to the growth in wages, to the point where those two lines, right, have now crossed. So the rate of inflation, right, the rate of the cost of goods is increasing faster than wages are able to keep up, which means, right, your wages are not able to go as far. When the cost of your groceries is increasing faster than your wages, you do not have as much disposable income to afford on other things, which is why when we see this increasing rate of inflation, the groups of people who are most affected by this, right, are people on fixed incomes, right? So older people on programs like Social Security, as well as poorer people who don't have as much disposable loose income to spend on things additionally other than basic necessities. That's a real serious issue, and why I think a lot of people feel like they are existing in two separate economies, whereas a group of people who are very much struggling to afford the basics, and then another economy, right, when you go on these social media apps and you see people being able to still make these big purchases, it's affecting people differently. Interestingly, another measure of consumer sentiment, which is the poll done by the University of Michigan, found at the end of June that consumer sentiment had ticked up slightly from a 50-year low. So consumer sentiment, according to this poll, is about 49%. However, I think what's important to keep in mind is how consumers are feeling about the economy in a lot of ways is tied to the current gasoline prices, right? So during that time, there was talk of a ceasefire and a lot of real movement towards a ceasefire. Gas prices were starting to come down. But now we are seeing the ceasefire kind of fall apart and gas prices slowly starting to rise. So I think it's really important for us to keep in mind exactly the timing of when these surveys were done. But it generally seems like Americans are still incredibly frustrated about the state of the economy. Again, I think the goal of the Federal Reserve and other people is trying to keep inflation down, but ultimately we're kind of working against a current here. Between tariffs as well as the supply shock in oil, it's very hard to keep inflation under control unless you're going to massively raise interest rates. So we will just have to see what happens. And for now, that's all I got. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.